First of all, I would like to extend my deep thanks to the Tzu Chi Foundation for organizing this extraordinary event, and to Ted Huang for all his efforts, Dr. He, the volunteers of Tzu Chi, and Doel Weil for kindly inviting me. I am deeply touched by your care and compassion for others and the warm welcome we have received here. And if you start a school in Chicago, I will send my children there. My task today is to speak about some approaches to representing the past in Judaism as a model for, or at least a point of comparison for, how the foundation might approach this task in its own terms. Insofar as Jews are a people who live in the past, or more precisely, the past made present, a living past which shapes the future, this is no small task. In fact, it could amount to a summary of the entire religious literature of Judaism, most of which is concerned in some way with representing the past, as well as with developing and challenging other ways of doing so that already exist in Judaism. I will try to define my task in a much more modest and hopefully more practically useful way. Let us focus on the role of the author, who is supposedly in charge of representing the past in their text. On what basis do authors define their own role? Do authors see themselves as vehicles for the group, a mouthpiece who gives voice to what the group already believes and thinks about itself? Or do they see themselves as individual voices with their own distinctive stories about the past and their own personal qualifications for telling that story, even if it differs from what the group might think? In short, does their story about the past rest on tradition, or does it rest on authority? I have called this lecture Authority and/or Tradition because I would argue that those two ideas capture a fundamental tension which exists in Judaism when it represents the past. And it is my hope that by exploring this tension in Judaism, you may be able to draw practically useful analogies or comparisons to your own situation, your own dual role as both insiders to a tradition and authors of its own story about itself. Let us begin with a more common situation in which the author sets him or herself directly against tradition and attempts to reject or seize hold of the group's past in a new way. As we will see, the mainstream religious literature of Judaism does not offer many examples of this, which is not to say that some have not tried. Their efforts are instructive failures for the most part. They show us the limits that a tradition places on authors who try to impose a too radical interpretation of the past, or examples of authors who did succeed in seizing the past, but who thereby ceased to be widely accepted as Jews. For your purposes, as historians of Tzu Chi, you might see these examples as cautionary tales. The first cautionary tale is an author who tried but failed to escape from tradition. This is the author of the biblical book of Ecclesiastes, or Kohelet in Hebrew, meaning one who calls to assembly or a preacher. This book, which likely comes from the Hellenistic period, around 250 BCE, and reflects the growing influence of Greek terms and ideas on Jews of that time, is attributed by later readers to King Solomon, who they say wrote it at the end of his life because, unlike the love poems in the Song of Songs that he wrote in his youth, only an old man could have such a bleak view of life. But that understanding of the book is biased by centuries of trying to actively suppress its radical message. It is a sign that something about what the author of Kohelet had to say about the past was correctly perceived as too novel, too individual, too reliant on his own authority to be accepted by tradition. Rather than bleak or negative, a less biased word for this author's way of facing the past might be critical. The author of Kohelet preaches to ask yourself why studying the past matters. And he raises questions about whether it matters at all. If, as he holds, everything is predetermined by God, and we cannot know, let alone control, what will happen to us in the future, then why should we spend time with the past? Wouldn't it be better, as he sometimes seems to argue, to live for the present, to enjoy a glass of wine, a good meal, the pleasures of the flesh, and to forget about what came before us, especially if, as he famously says, there is nothing new under the sun? If the past is not a practical guide for how we should act or what will happen in the future, who cares? And this is the first quotation from this radical book. He says, "For I have set my mind to know wisdom and to see the business that is done in the world, even letting my eyes go sleepless day and night, and I have seen all that God brings to pass." It seems to me that many of you let yourselves go sleepless day and night also in your work for Tzu Chi. So you can understand this commitment that he had. For man cannot find out what happens under the sun. He seeks and does not find, toil as he might. And even if a sage purports to know, nor can he find it out. The author's claim in this passage is radical because he does not reject tradition, or what he calls wisdom out of mere ignorance. On the contrary, he embodies the traditional Jewish ideal of a man who studies, as they say, yomam v'layla, day and night. He goes, as he says, like you, without sleep, in order to set his mind on the ways of God. However, he concludes no amount of wisdom or hard work can ever add up to knowledge of God. Our fate is in God's hands, and no study of the past or wisdom of our ancestors can prevent us from the joy and suffering that God deals out to us for reasons that we cannot know or control. Therefore, there is just as strong a case for saying nothing as there is for speaking about the past. He says, "Let not your mouth be rash, and let not your heart be quick to bring forth speech before God. For God is in heaven, and you are on earth. Therefore, let your words be few." This is a bold challenge to the entire notion of tradition in Judaism, which is based on the idea that we must study the past in order to know what to do in the present and what to expect in the future. Jews speak about their past in order to bridge what this author sees as an infinite gap between God in heaven and ourselves on earth, trying to decipher God's messages to us in our history. To give up on this process of speaking about our past is to give up on a direct relationship to God and to accept that we are no different than the rest of the natural world, which was not given the ability to speak and reflect on its own existence. To give up on the study of the past is not only to give up on God, it is to give up on our humanity. So this is a radical idea, influenced by Greek philosophy, spoken by a Jewish thinker. And it was so radical that although it was not deleted from the Bible, we can still see it, this author's rejection of tradition was so powerful that a later scribe of his book felt the need to censor him by inserting a tradition which undermines his message at the end of the book and partially restores the value of tradition. In fact, later authorities quote this conclusion and say that if it had not been written, they would have removed the entire book. The sum of the matter, all has been heard, fear God and keep his commandments, for that is all that man is. For God shall bring one to account for every deed, for all that is concealed, whether good or evil. Interestingly, this later scribe accepts the book's argument that we cannot necessarily know what God expects of us. But he does not accept the radical idea that we cannot know God at all. To be human is to obey the will of God, even if we are in the dark about what precisely it is. God's ways may be hidden from humanity, but our ways are never hidden from God. And our actions are weighed by God on God's own moral scales. The author of the original book tried to go beyond tradition and stake his authority on preaching that readers should live in the present, leaving the past behind. But by reimposing tradition on him at the end of the book, this scribe insisted that the sacred books of the Jews, the Bible's laws and commandments, are a permanent record of what God expects of us. Our job is to obey them, even if we cannot understand them. And that is the paradox. How do you obey something you can't understand? This conflict between collective tradition and individual authority over the past ended in a compromise, a book of the Bible which contradicts itself. In the later period of early Christianity, as the apostles' writings on Jesus were collected in the canon of the New Testament, we find a more divisive example, an authority who not only questions the past's traditional meaning for Jews, but deliberately tries to erase and replace it. He succeeds at the cost of the Jewish community. In other words, this author's appeal to a new authority over the past ruptures the continuity between Jews who followed Jesus and Jews who did not. That was a continuity, a connection between Jesus Jews and non-Jesus Jews that Jesus himself, according to his apostles, wanted to maintain. However, this author, by rejecting one side of his tradition and promoting his own authority, led to a schism between those groups of Jews, which became a schism between Judaism and Christianity. I am referring to Marcion, a shadowy figure whose writings are only preserved in other sources and whose true beliefs are therefore hard to determine. Nevertheless, it does seem that Marcion rejected the Jews' sacred writings, which he called the laws and the prophets, and proposed to replace those books with what he called a new document or New Testament, in the legal sense of a will, which voids all previous copies of the will once it has been updated. That is the very opposite of what Jesus, according to most of his apostles, said about his relationship to Jewish tradition. We can see this by examining how Marcion misquotes the apostles. First, Marcion's contemporary, the Christian bishop Irenaeus, lamented Marcion's attack on the Jews' sacred writings. He says, Marcion of Pontus advanced the most daring blasphemy against him who is proclaimed as God by the law and the prophets. Marcion said that Jesus was manifested in the form of a man to those who were in Judea, the territory of the Jews, abolishing the prophets and the law, and all the works of that God who made the world, the God of the Old Testament, the writings of the Jews. Besides this, Marcion mutilates the gospel, which is according to Luke. So, note here that these traditional sacred books of the Jews, what Marcion called the Old Testament, are twice referred to as the targets of Marcion's attack on Jewish tradition. Apparently, he rejected the idea that the Jewish prophets in the Bible did not predict the arrival of the Messiah in the person of Jesus, an idea which is a fundamental way of preserving continuity between Jesus Jews and non-Jesus Jews in other Christian writings. Instead, Marcion tried to leave the past behind and create a new canon of sacred books based only on the New Testament. This meant that he had to rewrite passages from the apostles who had a different view, which contradict his version of Jesus' teaching. When Irenaeus says here that he, quote, mutilates the Gospel of Luke, for instance, he may have had in mind passages like this one, where Marcion seems to simply add his own idea that Jesus was attacked by other Jewish authorities because he rejected the authority of the law and prophets. So in the book of Luke, it says, the Jewish elders began to accuse Jesus, saying, we found this man perverting our nation. And in Marcion's version of the verse, it says, the Jewish elders began to accuse Jesus, saying, we found this man perverting our nation. And then Marcion adds, and destroying the law and the prophets. Okay? So if a Christian reader of Marcion's version only knew this version of the story of Jesus, they would believe that their Lord was crucified because he rejected Jewish tradition. And so they must also reject it. However, not only does Marcion mutilate the text of the Apostle Luke in order to make this point, he also contradicts the Apostle Matthew and other parallel versions of Jesus' own words. In Jesus' most famous speech, the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew quotes Jesus as saying exactly the opposite. Jesus says, do not think that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, Not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, the Jewish elders, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. So, in Matthew's version and the other apostles' versions of Jesus' teaching, he was not hated by the Jewish elders because he tried to abolish the law and the prophets, the Jewish sacred writings. On the contrary, he taught his followers to be better Jews than them, to fulfill the meaning of their traditional texts. Faith in those texts was a prerequisite for salvation, not superseded by him and his gospel. It was Marcion who decided that his authority should replace this Jewish tradition by setting Jesus on a pedestal at the expense of the Jewish community. And by the way, as a consequence of the schism between Jews and Christians that Marcion helped to cause, my hotel room in Taipei, for instance, like all American hotel rooms, only has a copy of the New Testament. So far, in this lecture, I have shown you two cautionary tales of what can happen to authors who reject their tradition's wisdom and their written record of their past in order to assert their personal authority to redefine it. Either they can be censored partially, which results in a self-contradictory legacy, or they can choose between total censorship and provoking a religious schism or divide inside their community. In either case, the individual and the tradition are in conflict, not collaboration. However, I did not introduce these authors only as bad examples. Even if they did not succeed, they show us that there is no such thing as a neutral record of the past. Everyone has a point of view. To write about the past means to confront different points of view and to say something about the past in dialogue with those points of view. The question is how to do so. How can one keep continuity with tradition by preserving what one's readers already believe about the past, even as one asserts one's authority to tell a new story? This is what we can learn from Jewish authors who avoided direct conflict with tradition despite their originality. If our first examples were cautionary tales, these examples may serve you as better models. For these examples, I turn to the early rabbis, teachers who created a canon of biblical interpretations which became a touchstone for nearly all later Jewish religion. The context of the rabbis made representing the past all the more essential. Jews had had two failed revolts against their Roman rulers. Their cult center, the temple, had been destroyed, and the community was on the brink of death. Many had been killed or fled, others had assimilated to Roman culture, and it was becoming harder for Jews to have faith in a God who could allow his children to be massacred, his house destroyed, and his name dishonored. The rabbis could have responded to this situation in various ways, but they turned back to the Jewish tradition of the prophets, who encouraged the Jewish people to look beyond history and seek in it a lesson from God. Rather than sacrifice tradition for the sake of life or life for the sake of tradition, rabbis based their authority on Jewish tradition, which for them was life itself. We see how these rabbis grounded their authority in tradition by examining their use of the chain of transmission, one of their favorite metaphors for claiming continuity with the past. This metaphor appears in a historical preface to their book, Fathers, a collection of ethical teachings by their ancestors, the earliest rabbis, whom they call men of the great assembly. They say, Moses received law from Sinai, the mountain where the Torah was revealed, and transmitted it to Joshua, and Joshua transmitted it to the elders, and the elders transmitted it to the prophets, and the prophets transmitted it to the men of the great assembly, who said three things. be prudent in judgment, and raise up many disciples, and make a fence for the law. By framing their own tradition in this way, rabbis base their authority on the Bible. Just as the law was given by God to the prophet Moses on Sinai, so was that law passed down through the generations until it reached the rabbis themselves. When they inherit and transmit the past of their ancestors, they portray themselves not as new authorities, but as part of an unbroken tradition of revelation directly from God. There are just two minor problems with this argument. The first is that the rabbis' words are actually not in the Bible. Some of them are new teachings, such as here, be prudent in judgment. Others are rabbinic interpretations of the Bible's laws and commandments. So this is what they mean when they say, make a fence for the law. Safeguard the law by adding new interpretations which prevent the law from being broken or forgotten. But who is to say that the rabbis' interpretations are the right ones, let alone that they are the same as the Bible itself? This leads to the second problem with the chain of transmission. It claims to be unbroken, but it leaves out a key link, the priesthood, another group of authorities who were tasked with maintaining the temple cult and interpreting the laws of purity, religious taxes, and sacrifices. Even though the temple had been destroyed, Jews who belonged to the priestly group certainly held authority over some areas of life, and the rabbis probably saw them as competitors. So, even as they base their authority on tradition, the rabbis exclude other authorities from tradition. These problems remind us that it is never a neutral act to claim the authority of tradition. It may link the author and community, but silence others who wish to speak for the tradition. It may expand the tradition to include new ideas under the cover of an idea of pure continuity with the timeless past. This is not necessarily good or bad, and if you have a position of authority, it is inevitable. But it reminds you that you can challenge and change the collective meaning of the past in different ways without necessarily becoming a radical heretic or like Marcion or a skeptic like Kohelet. It is just as important for us to criticize traditional authorities when they silence certain voices as it is to hear what they say about the past. These exclusions mean just as much as what is included. So, to conclude, I myself believe that the genius of the rabbis and the key to their success in the Jewish community when they recorded the past is how they confronted the danger of this potential conflict between authority and tradition by recording their tradition in a special form, in the form of dialogues and debates. For example, here, they tell a story, which we can talk about in discussion if you want, about the origins of their movement, of their organization. And in the story, they say they are afraid that their teachings will be lost, and they must organize them, they must discover them, and they must pass them on to future generations. And then they begin reciting these traditions and organizing these traditions of their teachers, Hillel and Shammai. But they don't just record one point of view, they record arguments between points of view. And that is how they record their past, in the form of debates and dialogues. And so I myself believe that the genius of the rabbis and why they remained the basis for Judaism is that they confronted and overcame the conflict between authority and tradition by preserving a tradition of conflict, a tradition of debates. Rather than only keep one interpretation of the past or one version, they transmitted arguments between their ancestors about every subject, from huge questions like the will of God to tiny questions like the example here, where these two authorities argue about a handful of flour. Because they put dialogue with the past at the center of Jewish tradition, even if they did exclude some voices, and they did make some voices louder than others, they left the door open for future generations to disagree. They respected their parents and repeated what they said, but they did not tell their children to shut up. Instead, they kept a conversation between their parents and their children going by reminding their children that their parents also argued, just as Hillel and Shammai argue here over one handful of flour. They taught their people that it was more important to know how to argue about the past and what those arguments are truly about in terms of our relationship to God than it was to know the single authoritative true version of the past for everyone. By redefining Judaism as a tradition of dialogue with the past, they allowed later generations to revive dissenting opinions or neglected ideas which were preserved in these debates, and thereby to rewrite their tradition for themselves in light of new circumstances as history continued to change. This is what they mean when they call their Torah a Torah of life, a living tradition. I hope, as you write your history, that you can take something from each of these authors. I hope you will be brave, like the author of Ecclesiastes, and challenge your readers to decide for themselves why they are reading your book about the past. I hope you will be humble, like the scribe who censored Ecclesiastes, and repeat the lessons of your past, even if you do not understand them. I hope you will be prudent, like the apostles of Jesus, and record your master's teachings in a form which does not divide your community in two. And I hope you will be like the rabbis, who knew that their parents were wise, but also that their children were not stupid, and who kept them all alive by making them talk to each other. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Redfield. Okay. Now we would like to open the floor for questions. 好，那我们现在开放问问题的时间。那如果您刚刚对讲师的内容有疑问或者是想法，欢迎您提出来。可以欢迎大家以中文提问。好，问题。Yes, please, Dr. Lori Lai.
非常谢谢老师，很精彩的内容哈，对我们来说虽然有点陌生，但是是一个很有意义的切入点。我想要请老师多描述如何记录辩论的过程，就是刚才有提到，不是只是就是忠实的记录，连讨论的过程也会被留下来。那在犹太教中，如何将讨论过程也留下来？因为您知道的，它可能会不断的反复啊，它会有些 debate 啊，然后可能最后没有结果，那这样不会显得冗长吗？这是我的问题。但是好像它又很有意义，对。
Thank you. Your question is very important because you cannot write everything down. You have to be selective. Even if you are not just writing one point of view, but you are writing multiple points of view, you still have to be selective. How are you making those choices? This is the question. The way that Judaism in the rabbis' literature does it is to pose a problem. There's always a shared problem that people are arguing about. And so these arguments are different points of view on the same problem. And when they transmit the past in the form of problems that the community is dealing with. and they allow for those problems to have multiple points of view in their tradition, so that later people can solve those problems differently. For example, right? If these two authorities say we should make a ritual offering from one handful of dough, and these authorities say we should make it from 2 handfuls of dough, at one time, this group may win, this group may lose because of that situation. But later, there could be a new situation where there's a better reason for the community to say, no, this group should win, right? But they can't say that if we don't know that opinion, right? The past then just is one directional instead of like a highway with different lanes, different places you can turn, different directions you can go, right? And that's the importance. But the problems themselves are what keep the community together, because everybody cares how to make the ritual offering, right? Everybody wants to know, how do we do it? And if you don't care, then you don't care if it's 1 or 2, right? So also by getting involved in these arguments, like you don't know anything about the ritual offering, but you care about who's right. I know you do. I know you're thinking, oh, I think he's right. I think he's right, right? I know you're thinking, oh, I want to take this side. That's how the Jews keep the community involved in the problems which define the tradition, is to teach their children, teach the future generations how to argue about them and what the terms of the debate are. And I think that's more important than simply the quantity of opinions that you preserve.
好，那我们执行长也有个问题在前面。
首先谢谢James 他刚刚精彩的演讲啊。那您刚刚提到，你现在在芝加哥，你说如果我们芝加哥有学校的话，你愿意把你的小孩送去芝加哥我们的学校念书？那我们芝加哥现在还没有学校，但是有一个 branch office 在那里，在 Chicago Chinatown， 然后我们刚刚才完成重建，所以欢迎你去那边，他们一定会很欢迎你哈。
Thank you.
那我的问题是，就我是很简单，就是我以前是基督徒，I'm a Christian. I used to be a Christian. 那我现在是 convert 但是我对于圣经上所讲的，我现在都还记得，同时我也会尽量遵守圣经上所教这个上帝所教导的这些teachings，但是我很好奇，都同样是来自于圣经能不能很简单的告诉我们，犹太教、基督教、伊斯兰教最主要是差别在哪里？这个抱歉，我浪费大家时间如果可以解释的话。
Thank you, and we will discuss this in the workshop tomorrow as well. We will think about. We will discuss this in the workshop tomorrow as well. We will think about this comparison of religions. So I hope we will be able to speak more. But in a sense, the question is, for me, in Judaism, in the study of Judaism, is, what does the study of other religions teach Jews about what God wants from them, right? God doesn't want Jews to just study other religions just for speculation, just because it's interesting, okay? That can be dangerous. You can end up converting to Buddhism, and a lot of Jews do that, right? That's not Jewish teaching, right? But also Judaism doesn't believe, and that's different, I think, from some religions, doesn't believe that there's one universal message from God to everyone. God spoke to the Jewish people in the form of the Bible on Mount Sinai through their prophet Moses, and that is a communication between God and the Jews, right? So the Jews always have to face the truth that there are other people in the world. 'What are they doing there? Why are they there? What do they have to teach? But the Jews also have to face the truth that there are other people in the world. 'What are they doing there? Why are they there? 'What do they have to teach? 'What are they doing there? Why are they there? 'What are they doing there? Why are they there? 'What are they doing there? Why are they there? 'What are they doing there? Why are they there? 'What are they doing there? Why are they there? 'What are they doing there? Why are they there? 'What are they doing there? Why are they there? 'What are they doing there? Why are they there? 'What are they doing there? Why are they there? 'What are they doing there? Why are they there? 'What are they doing there? Why are they there? 'What are they doing there? Why are they there? 'What are they doing there? Why are they there? 'What are they doing there? Why are they there? 'What are they doing there? Why are they there? 'What are they doing there? Why are they there? 'What are they doing there? Why are they there? 'What are they doing there? Why are Well, they can be good examples or they can be bad examples. And that's usually how, that's how Judaism approaches your question. It's like in my talk, you look for other people's, they don't have to be Jews to teach the Jews how to be good people, how to obey the will of God, how to understand God's messages, right? In fact, many Jews are bad and many non-Jews are good, right? That's not a problem, right? But, there are also examples of people who clearly didn't get God's message and who have, idolatry, other kinds of religion, which show Jews the truth of their own religion by contrast. So that is sort of how the religion generally approaches this major important question. And thank you. I will take my children to your center as soon as I get home. Thank you.
Thank you. 谢谢执行长，感恩。那我们还有璇依有问题吗 ？OK， 好，我们后面这师兄。
感恩老师刚刚对瑞玲老师的解释哈，因为我蛮赞成的，就是说，其实宗教哈，它并不是说一定是要照某一个特定的文字上去描述，而是它的实用性，就如同老师刚才讲的，一团面粉和两团面粉，其实它都有它解决问题的方法。那如果说我们只相信一种的话，可能会局限了我们对宗教的认知，所以我们应该比较开阔的去了解更多。谢谢。
感恩师兄。对。
那个，其实我的问题是，因为每一个宗教它都有它的主张，那但是在我们在创造历史的时候，在叙述历史的时候，我们是不是应该要多保有各个不同的论点，去更深入的去了解宗教真正的含义？谢谢。这样算问题吗？
No, that is a very good question, and thank you. And the answer, I think, for Jews is yes, but not all of them. Not all of them. So that is the difficult part. In other words, there are religious principles, there are religious values that determine what differences are included and what differences are excluded. Okay? And those values are like the problems I spoke about earlier. For example, if we eat a certain way, if we only eat certain foods, what exactly can we eat? What exactly can we not eat? This is a big question. It defines which Jews can eat at each other's houses, which Jews can visit each other's families, who is part of the community, right? And so it's important to argue about that, right? We should not preserve the opinions of people who say, we can eat anything, it doesn't matter, okay? So there's a problem that's an argument about specific things within the community that have a religious value in the Bible. And then there are views that are outside of that. Now the problem is the boundary between those two things is not very clear. For you, it might be a valid opinion. For me, it might be something I need to silence. So is Judaism open-minded to dialogue? Is it open-minded to a very narrow kind of dialogue between just a few authorities, right? That is an argument that Judaism has about itself all the time. And that's why we have denominations of Judaism now, different branches of Judaism, which have different opinions about this question. That doesn't mean that those people are not Jews. Everybody who participates in the conversation is a Jew. So ultimately, as the rabbis say, a Jew, even if he sins, remains a Jew. Your opinions themselves don't necessarily exclude you, even if they're radical. It's the practices that you follow, including and especially the practices of dialogue, which keep you part of the community. So I think there may be a lesson there. Thank you.
Thank you. 谢谢，感恩我们的讲师。I have a question, if I may. Okay. And I'd like to ask, what if in Markian's case, where the authority's voice is more outspoken and sometimes overpowers tradition, such as the case in early Christianity, where the schism happened, how should we explain our tradition to future generations, and especially in today's social media, where there are a lot of rhetoric that's odd?
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, you know, the particular case of your tradition is fascinating to me because your master's teachings, and there are already books of your master's teachings. There are already traditions about your master. Everyone I've met here has told me a different thing about master that I learned. You know, master is very frugal. Master washes with this bowl of water. Master, you know, took the train to Hualien and came here. So I've only been here 2 days. I hear all these stories about master, right? Okay. So you have to write those down, obviously. You have to write them down. You have to write down different versions of them. You have to write down different opinions about the details. You have to write down what Master said. Also, different times Master maybe said contradictory things. That's not necessarily bad from a Jewish point of view, right? Because they're all teaching. They're all part of Master's teaching. So there's not one Master. Each of you has a conversation with Master that's going on, and that's what it is to be part of a tradition, to keep that conversation going on. That's why you write the past down. But there is a danger at times that some people will try to take that legacy. Some people, I'm not saying in your case, God forbid, but in some communities, people try to take the legacy. They try to say, this is my master, not yours, and mine has this teaching and it contradicts this other one in a fundamental way. The problem with that is not simply, at least from a Jewish point of view, the problem with that is not simply that it's radical or it's arrogant. That's not simply the problem. The real problem is for your children, for future generations, you don't know what kind of problems they're going to have. You don't know what their needs are going to be. You don't know what their questions for Master are going to end up being. You can't predict that. All you can do is give them enough of a feeling and a flavor and a tradition for Master's teaching that they will know that it's different from the world that they live in, from the problems that they are confronting, from the questions that they have. And it's the difference between the past and the present. It's the difference between their questions and what Master had to say, or what your tradition has to say. The difference is what will be valuable to them, because they will have something to go back to, something to argue with, something to rely on, something to challenge and question that's more than just what they are given by their society. Right? And I think that's preserving that conversation is the most important thing.
Thank you, thank you. 好，那我们还有学员有问题吗？好，那非常感恩我们的讲师 ，Thank you, Dr. Redfield。那我们现在呢，要请严博文执行長來代表慈濟基金會贈送講師結緣品。Hold on a minute, Dr. Redfield. We would like to invite our CEO, Mr. Yan, to present a gift to Professor Redfield. 很感恩讲师深入浅出哦，就是很迅速的说明了犹太教的历史哈，然后为我们这样讲解犹太教的宗教史记。感恩 ，Thank you. Okay. 谢谢。好，要记得看一下哦。Let's look at our camera volunteer. Okay, can we do that again? And then look to the camera volunteer. Yes, we gotta say. Yes, look at the camera. Yes, please. Yeah, we gotta keep this moment, right? Yes, in footage. Yeah, thank you. 谢谢，感恩执行长。